Thank you, Jay. Good morning, everyone. Trustees, presidents, and students. Hey, how about a shout out to our two students who stood up and asked those questions earlier this morning? If there is anything that will inspire us, it will be to hear those wonderful young folks stand up and ask something so articulate. So it is my honor to introduce one of the most visible and trailblazing secretaries of transportation history, Pete Buttigieg. Secretary Buttigieg was sworn into office on February 3rd, 2021. His focus as secretary is to deliver the world's leading transportation system for the American people and economy. He has organized to achieve organizational excellence in the department's operations and to focus the department on 5 policy goals: safety, jobs, equity, climate, and innovation. In his first year at the department, he prioritized supporting the development and passage of President Biden's signature bipartisan infrastructure law. Since the law's passage, Secretary Buttigieg and his team have focused on effectively delivering the investments provided by the legislation, enabling the most significant improvements in U.S. transportation infrastructure in over half a century. The Secretary has also focused on intervening to support American supply chains dealing with shockwaves from the pandemic, including measures to help cut in half the container congestion at America's largest ports. Other major initiatives in his early tenure have included a comprehensive national roadway safety strategy to reduce deaths and serious injuries, delivery of emergency COVID-19 relief funds to transit agencies across America, and awards of over $9.5 billion in discretionary funding to enhance transportation through over 800 projects in communities across America. The first openly gay person confirmed to serve in a president's cabinet, Secretary Buttigieg previously served 2 terms as mayor of his hometown, South Bend, Indiana, go Irish, where he worked across the aisle to transform the city's future. Household income grew, poverty fell, and unemployment was cut in half. He also served for 7 years as an officer in the U.S. Navy Reserve, taking a leave of absence from the mayor's office for a deployment to Afghanistan in 2014. The son of Joseph Buttigieg, who immigrated to the United States from Malta, and Jennifer Ann Montgomery, a 5th-generation Hoosier, Secretary Buttigieg is a graduate of Harvard University in Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar and completed a degree in philosophy, politics, and economics. He lives with his husband, Chasten, their 2 children, Gus and Penelope, and their 2 dogs. And today, ladies and gentlemen, he is here to speak to us about our national infrastructure and all matters of transportation, especially those that stand to affect our students and their futures. Please join me in welcoming Secretary Pete Buttigieg.
Good morning. Thank you. Thank you so much for the chance to join you, and I'm not accustomed to this rousing of a welcome this early in the morning, so I admire your energy. Thank you very much, Dr. Schaefer. Thank you to the Association of Community College Trustees. Thank you to the American Association of Community Colleges and everybody who's making this event happen. It's an extraordinary time for transportation in America, as you know, as you are living in your respective communities and as we are living at the US DOT. A time of enormous challenges created by economic gyrations, the after effects of the COVID pandemic, and decades of underinvestment catching up to us in forms that have been felt on everything from container shipping to passenger airline delays. But also the best time to be working on transportation in my lifetime and then some, because of the President's historic bipartisan infrastructure law and because of the shared national sense of purpose, backed by real resources, to do something new and meaningful and lasting when it comes to how we safely move people and goods around the country. And so I just want to take a couple of minutes to reflect on how that connects to the work that you are leading before we get into our conversation. Let me start by thanking you for your indispensable role, collectively for our nation and individually in the communities where you lead. Saw it firsthand as mayor of South Bend. Yes, go Irish, but also go Ivy Tech. We're very proud of our excellent Ivy Tech network of community colleges who were such a key partner in preparing new generations of workers for new opportunities and preparing older generations of workers for new opportunities that were coming their way, making sure that they could thrive in the developing and changing economy of the industrial Midwest as we saw South Bend enter its comeback decade. And I am now a resident of Traverse City, Michigan, home of Northwest Michigan College. We've got some Michigan folks here. Just a few months ago, my husband Chasten walked me around the campus of NMC, pointing out how important it had been to him as a student. And in addition to having shaped my husband, it is also a key partner to the U.S. DOT as host of the Great Lakes Maritime Academy. So just two examples of the institutions that I've come to know as a resident and in my role. But I've also had the great pleasure of traveling to many colleges and seeing how you are helping us to make sure that America succeeds in this transportation moment. We were at Heartland Community College in Normal, Illinois. Heartland's here too, great. So you know all about the importance of preparing students for the opportunities around electric vehicles, which are increasingly not just being bought in America, but being made in America, which is a major priority for President Biden. We were at Lehigh Carbon Community College in Pennsylvania, where fellow veterans are receiving no-cost training to get commercial driver's licenses when we need more drivers like them, and they are ready to accept that good job. In New Jersey, County College of Morris, met students being trained in, you got some amazing robots out there. I can't quite see you, but there you are. The advanced manufacturing and critical infrastructure that you were preparing students for. We were at Tri-C Cuyahoga Community College, seeing in action what it means to have the kind of transit partnership that helps make sure that you can literally keep your community running with the skills that you cultivate. This is so important because the nature of the infrastructure law, the proportions of the infrastructure law, are such that the building that we're going to do and the upgrades that we are doing right now are testing the productive capacity of the United States of America. Not just in terms of raw materials, but in terms of the human capital that you are in the business of cultivating. The president and I and everyone in the administration is thrilled about how many great paying jobs are being created that don't necessarily require four-year university degrees, but they absolutely require skills and training and the kinds of degrees that are available through outstanding programming at our community colleges. Making sure that we have enough qualified people to fully deliver on this national project is also the project of making sure that we are building generational wealth that families will thrive on for generations to come. And it's especially important because we have an opportunity, again, because of the proportions of this project, to materially help to close wealth gaps in our country in this decade. Your institutions serve an above average percentage of Black and brown low-income students during a moment when our department and many state DOTs and unions are actively recruiting to make sure that this generation of carpenters and electricians and operating engineers look like and represent all of America. You have been so thoughtful about how to make sure working parents, working mothers are able to build their skills and ladder up to better paying jobs. We need to keep building the partnerships between our department, your colleges, and the transportation and infrastructure organizations that are going to be hiring like never before. But it brings me to a second thing I want to make sure we talk about and think about today, which is a little bit ironic, which is that we can only train that transportation workforce of tomorrow if they are able to get transportation to job sites and to get to college, to get to your institutions, to get the skills that they need. No matter what they are studying, for college students, transportation is perhaps the most important prerequisite of all. And we've seen some illuminating new research from the Civic Mapping Initiative, which looked at community colleges and found that only 57% of primary campuses today have transit stops within working distance, but that we could make 25% of the remaining ones accessible just by extending a bus line that already exists. Just one example of the value we see that has helped motivate the Biden-Harris administration to be making the largest federal investment in public transit in the history of the United States. We are in the middle right now of getting that funding out the door. But what we really need to do is work with transit agencies on how best to use that funding. So if you're not in touch with your transit agency, I know many of you have deep partnerships with the transit agencies in your community, both supplying trained employees and helping to get your students to where they need to be. But if you don't, or if you think that you could build on that partnership, now is the best possible time to do it. You are leading one of the most important sets of institutions in our country, responsible for economic mobility, workforce development, civic engagement, and leadership. In short, helping to pave the way toward the American dream. And there is so much opportunity ahead that I am just delighted to have a chance to be with you and enthusiastic about what we could take great pride in later on, looking back on the 2020s and what we did together. So with that, I'll go over to my seat and join the conversation. Thank you again for the chance to be with you today.
Thank you for joining us today, Secretary Buttigieg. We'll start with a conversation and then go to the questions from the audience. So please start thinking about what you might want to ask the good Secretary. Secretary, often when people think of community colleges and the federal government, the Departments of Education and Labor come to mind. How do colleges interact with the Department of Transportation for both access and workforce readiness?
So let me build out a little more on what we were saying about access. You know that so many of the students that you're reaching are getting onto a pathway that is not just an inheritance, a multi-generational pattern of being in the same trade or having the same skill or going to the same university, but people who are trying to do something that is new to them in either whether they're mid-career or whether they're coming out of high school. And there's a very literal sense in which navigating that is difficult. Obviously, navigating FAFSA and navigating apprenticeship programs and some of the many things that my colleagues at Department of Education, Department of Labor work on are important. But also, whether a student feels and is equipped and ready and well served in just literally getting to where they need to be. I think it's one of the most important obligations we have as the federal agency that is funding so many transit agencies in our community. And I would even go a step further and say not only is this a question about transit in the short to medium term, this is actually a question about land use and planning in the medium to long term. So as you're setting out your capital plans, think about how the built environment of the communities that you're in, whether we're talking about a dense city or whether we're talking about a rural campus, might look different when we come to the other end of the evolution in post-COVID commuting patterns, when we enter a period where autonomous vehicles are playing more of a role, when we see the different models for transit and transportation really take hold according to more of a 2050 pattern than a 1950 pattern. These are things that are very much within the lifetime of some of the decisions that community college leaders are responsible for making right now. So those are some of the things that are on my mind. And then there's the more direct partnerships that we have. Our grant programs are very focused on the workforce piece because, again, we won't succeed without it. And so it is not just we want to make sure we help you succeed, but we're counting on you to help this mission of rebuilding America succeed.
Thank you. I come from beautiful Rocky Mountain West, but we serve very, very rural and desperate populations, and so very passionate about what we're doing in rural America. And the irony isn't lost on me that the very departments, agencies that need help with the workforce to keep the roads open and going are also the very barriers that keep many of our populations from coming to college and actually pursuing those careers and those opportunities. And so appreciate your focus on transportation, appreciate your focus on helping those populations achieve their dream by having the opportunity to actually come to campus, without a doubt. Thank you. Mr. Secretary, the Department of Transportation is leading the implementation of the Bipartisan Infrastructure and Jobs Law. Two areas of that law are interested to community colleges. Two areas of that law interested to community colleges. In order to be successful in that implementation, a trained transportation workforce is needed. How can community colleges contribute to that effort?
So many of you have explicit partnerships, either with industry or with transit agencies near you. If you don't, I would encourage you just to do a little bit of a fact-finding mission with your nearest transit agency, with your state DOT, to see what they think how the needs are likely to unfold. And I think of this in particular in terms of the shifting tasks that are going to come with some of the shifting technologies. Give you a good example. We are investing in unprecedented terms in helping transit agencies to acquire zero and low emission buses. Now, just like a diesel bus, it needs to be worked on, but unlike a diesel bus, it's very different equipment and requires a lot of training, a lot of sophistication, a lot of skills. So we actually have a 5% set aside within the low and no emission bus program, where if we're buying your community a bus or 10 buses, at least 5% of that needs to go into workforce development. And there's a good chance that your transit agency maybe hasn't had that experience of putting together a transit-oriented workforce development program of that kind. Maybe you haven't had that experience either, but now's the time to look into it because you can team up. So that's just that's part of what we're looking at Tri-C. So that's just one sliver of it. But the bigger issue I'm trying to get across here is that these partnerships need to happen, but that doesn't mean they'll happen on their own. It's going to take leadership. It's going to take planning into the future. Many, if not most of you, are guided by state legislators or state governments that themselves have a lot at stake in terms of how this infrastructure law moves out. Look, we're very proud of this federal legislation with federal money pushed and moved and signed by the president and by the Congress. But actually, for every dollar that we're picking and choosing in a discretionary program in my building, there are many, many more dollars that are going out to the states by formula. They, too, are dealing with an extraordinary growth in what is expected of them, in the resources they have to do it with. There needs to be a matching growth in the readiness of the workforce. And you might want to explore whether the folks whether it's your best allies in the state legislatures, or whether it's in communities or the private sector, or the folks who think most about transportation and construction and the folks who think most about workforce and training are talking to each other. And so often, you're the only person that both of them know. It just has to do with the role that community college leaders play in their communities. You will have deep relationships and a kind of visibility across industry that can see from construction to transportation to government, public sector, education, and might even in some cases be well positioned to convene that conversation if you don't think somebody else is. And we would welcome that and support that any way we could.
Great, fantastic. Continuing with the infrastructure law, it also includes federal funding to improve equitable access to public transit. How can community colleges leverage these funds to remove the transportation barriers for some of our students?
There we go. So there's a real need to make sure that students are physically able to get to where they're going. And here too, because I know how effective community college leaders often are in connecting the dots between the pipeline of skill training you're doing and the pipeline of jobs waiting on the other side, would encourage you to think in an integrated way about what a student's needs are going to be. The last thing you want to do is solve the problem of getting them to the campus and then not have an answer for them when they're leaving the campus and hoping to get these great paying jobs, and then wondering why a year or 2 years out, not nearly as many of your graduates
took hold in that employer as you had hoped or planned, right? So this calls for thinking more than one piece at a time. But part of what we have in mind when we're funding transit agencies to do this work is to make it easier, make it affordable. Some agencies are experimenting with fare-free travel. A lot of you will have arrangements like Ivy Tech did in South Bend where it's not universally fare-free, but it is for students. Finding ways to just take that cost, take that complexity, take that confusion off the table is huge. The other thing I would mention, you went through our top 5 policy priorities: safety, climate, jobs, equity, innovation. One form of innovation I find very interesting is where many local transit authorities, instead of just viewing the kind of Uber, Lyft style transportation technology as something that will always come at the expense of transit when it comes to last mile, to actually embrace and use it themselves. Dial-a-ride services could be much more efficient if there were an easier way to summon them, and the technology exists. It's what companies like Uber and Lyft use every day. And I've seen very creative transit agencies, Kansas City is one, look at this. So just one more example of something that I think it would be helpful for community colleges to be at the table at. Because the bottom line is you have to literally get people to these opportunities. And then, of course, there's the digital side, right? I don't know if anybody's totally figured out what this new normal is going to be, even now. But we know that we're not going back to 2019. And just as we're working on it at the policy level, and for that matter, just as an employer of 55,000 people, we want to stay in touch with you as you're working through educational models that acknowledge that there are some things that you just plain have to be around other people to do, and yet that we, as of now, have not done everything we could to use remote and digital learning as efficiently as we one day will.
Thank you. Fascinating, especially the innovations around using what the commercial side, the private sector, is sort of driven around transportation and applying that to public transportation. I look forward to hearing more innovations that emerge in that space. Before I start my next question, I'd like to ask the audience to start making their way to the microphones. We have them placed in the room. If you have a question for Secretary Buttigieg, please start making your way there. Secretary, last Congress, President Biden also signed the Inflation Reduction Law, which included the Neighborhood Access and Equity Grant Program, which allows community colleges to partner locally to build transportation in a way that reconnects our communities. Can you share some examples of how community colleges can partner locally to dismantle some of those other transportation barriers?
Yeah, so I'm very excited about this part of the Inflation Reduction Act. It will be a companion to the Reconnecting Communities program, which is about $1 billion program in the infrastructure law. And this is about confronting the fact that a lot of infrastructure, especially but not only in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, was built in a way that actually sliced up or divided communities. The point of infrastructure is to connect. But we know that it didn't always work out that way. And often those divisions happen on racial lines. I don't raise this problem or this issue in order to wallow in it. I raise it because we can do something about it. And sometimes that is a massive physical infrastructure project like Detroit, where we're investing $100 million in taking a section of I-375 that cuts like a gash, wiped out the neighborhoods of Paradise Valley and Black Bottom when it went in, and can now be elevated and turned into a boulevard. And really transform what the community is like. In Atlanta, there's a vision that we're funding some of the planning of to stitch over a similar underpass. Other places, it could be a much more modest intervention. It's not about taking a giant highway and plunging it underground. It's about an overpass over a rail line that created a so-called wrong side of the tracks, but doesn't have to be that way. Or it could even be a transit link. The point is to be creative about how you link where there have been divisions in the past. And again, I see community colleges playing a really important and encouraging role here, not just in the community conversation, the policy conversation, bring some of the data you have about how people have been separated from the educational opportunity that equals economic opportunity because there's literally something in the way. But also, because your own capital planning might sometimes intersect with a community, literally. See what I did there? It's very hard not to make a transportation pun when you break it down. But might intersect with a community vision that in turn might be applying for federal funds. And I got to tell you, I mentioned we have a lot of discretionary funding right now. I mean, billions of dollars. We've done, I think, 1,800 projects so far. One way that a city or a state DOT can make their application in these extremely competitive processes more convincing is to demonstrate that they have partnered with their local educational institutions to help break down barriers. So you're helping them and helping a community help itself if you get involved in that process, and I hope many of you will. I know many of you have. I hope more of you will.
Yeah. Mr. Secretary, I know we've got some questions, but the conversation about inflation and your comments about capital plans bring this up. I'm going to go off script a little bit and make all these wonderful people up here a little nervous as I do so. So one of the interesting things about what we're struggling with right now is the greater pressures on community colleges, from funding streams, from the support, and as we try to invest in our own capital enterprises, our own capital instructions, as we look to build out, renovate, modernize our programs, the impacts of inflation and supply chain are hitting us, and they're hitting us hard. And the problem with that is it is pulling funds away from those direct provision of things to our students to pay for rapidly escalating construction costs, these cost delays because of supply chain challenges. And I know you've really been a champion in trying to remove those barriers and help us get quicker time to market. I don't know if you have any comments just in general about what you're doing around supply chain issues and helping with some of those challenges.
Yeah, no question. This is a huge challenge for anybody trying to do anything, whether you're trying to build a bridge or whether you're trying to build out a new satellite campus. And it's part of why we've been very focused on, first of all, addressing the infrastructure deficits that have led to those supply chain crunches, partly to begin with. Secondly, to tackle inflation itself, we're glad to see it coming down. There's more to go there. But also making sure that we stay ahead of anything that could cause a project to take longer than it should, because time is always money, but time is definitely a lot of money when you're in an inflationary environment where a year added to the length of a project is also something you can measure in many, many zeros added to the cost of that project. The best thing I think we can do as a department to help with that is to work with local project sponsors on lining up everything well in advance, including the community conversation, any environmental process that has to happen. Do it right, do it first, do it once, and don't get wrapped around the axle halfway through, because those inflationary pressures, which are a problem throughout the process, are at their most acute when the process is taking longer than it should.
Yeah. Great answer. All right, maybe we can bring up the lights slightly. It looks like we've got quite a few folks that have some questions. Why don't we start over here far on the left? If you would introduce yourself, young lady, tell us where you're from, and then ask the secretary your question.
Good morning. My name is Kara Sullivan. I'm the student trustee from the Alamo Colleges District in San Antonio. So something that stands out when we're talking about community colleges is the fact that they are made for the community. I know that in my district, we have partnerships with employers in the manufacturing and automobile industries. We ask them what technical training would prepare students to be employed by you. So my question is, how do you see the Department of Transportation investing in the technology needed by community colleges to prepare future members of the transportation industry?
Well, great question, Kara. First of all, let me applaud your institution for having a student trustee role. I think that really contributes to good decision making. And the question you're asking is so vital, because we're talking about a field that is going through enormous change. Whether we're talking about construction generally or transportation specifically, huge changes are coming in the 2020s. And being a step ahead of those, being ready to work with these technologies, put them to use, is going to be, frankly, one of the big deciders of whether America maintains our competitive edge relative to the rest of the world in our lifetime. And the best community colleges, I think, have found effective ways to get that feedback cycle from industry that is building out into, it may be new automation strategies, it may be new materials, but whatever is something that requires new forms of skills. And feeding that back into the curricula and into the training that happens, and then making sure that you follow up and see if that has served graduates well as they go into these jobs. From a DOT perspective, we try to be, how can I put this? We try to be aggressive and humble at the same time about technology. And what I mean by that is we try to be aggressive in the sense of funding good research. And by the way, we have a whole network of partnerships with university transportation centers that do a lot of this research with federal dollars. And pushing forward in terms of our own rules and regulations and standards. And things like that set aside I was mentioning when we're funding transit agencies to say, hey, you got to spend some of this money on workforce development. Find a partner like a community college and work on that. But we try to be humble at the same time. And what I mean by that is knowing that we're not going to always correctly guess what the most important transportation technologies will be. I remember being at a convening here in Washington as chair of the U.S. Conference of Mayors Task Force on Automation 7 years ago when we were being told that the widespread use of self-driving cars would happen 7 years, it would be 7 years away. And I think 7 years from now, we might still be talking about it. Don't get me wrong, those developments are coming, but not at the pace we thought. Meanwhile, I would argue, of all the things that are going on with propulsion and vertical takeoff and landing and drones and artificial intelligence, the most important transportation technology of the last decade turned out to be the smartphone. It's not even a vehicle. And yet it changed the way you get around, the way you navigate, the way you get a car, right? And so we're trying to make sure we are flexible and helping institutions and students be flexible with the skills that are going to matter, even knowing that some of the very specific expectations around those skills might evolve. And that's why also programs that do a form of badging and credentialing that can kind of turn over so that what you learn now on one form of electric vehicle will be something you can bolt on another credential to in 6 years when another element of it comes up, is something we want to be supporting too. We're not going to figure it all out in Washington. We don't have all the answers at the DOT, but more of the funding should be coming from Washington. That's what we're trying to get out to the communities right now.
Thank you.
Great question. Why don't we go here to the middle? Please, sir. Yes.
Hi. Thank you so much for your time. My name is Jerry Voxlach. I am a representative from the Student Senate for California Community Colleges. Like many students, I don't drive, so transportation issues especially hit home to me. But I'll get to my question. Has your department found evidence of the student needs for transportation change as classes increasingly turn to an online format?
Great question, and something that's very much on our mind. I'll be honest, we don't know yet in many ways. Whether we're talking about commuting patterns or whether we're talking about student needs. And of course, for so many community college students, there's an overlap there because there are so many working students in our community colleges who encounter the system as commuters and as students. We know certain things. We know that transit is always going to matter. We know that communities do better and countries do better when residents can get to where they need to go, whether they have a car or not. You shouldn't have to have 2 tons of metal with you in order to get to where you're going. And creating that level of freedom depends on the choices we make about what's available, what's affordable, and what's safe. Theoretically, you could ride a bike just about anywhere, but if it isn't safe, people aren't going to do it. And you can't ask people to do it if it isn't safe. And what excites me is that we do have ways, for example, with some of the arrival of rideshare technology being used by transit agencies, to not just rely on a hub and spoke system of 40-foot buses in every size community, regardless of its layout or its needs. But we're still seeing how some of these things unfold. So I believe we'll probably be more in the middle of this decade before there's been an equilibrium in terms of how commuting patterns and student patterns have settled after everything that got thrown by COVID. Because we learned 2 big things, right? At least this is my take on it. The first big thing we learned is the incredible capacity of tools like Zoom to bring us together, to get things done, to have meetings take place that didn't require to be twice as long in terms of how much time somebody took to participate in them because they had to go across town. And on the other hand, we learned that you can't do everything on Zoom, that actually the longer you rely on that, whether we're talking about a classroom dynamic or certainly an office dynamic, the more you start to see the subtle cost of not having body language and little conversations on the way in and out, and the little things that create a community, whether we're talking about a community of colleagues at work or a learning community. But maybe there are ways to create that aren't the same as pushing everybody into the same room in the ways that we used to. I think it would be, it just wouldn't be true to say that we know yet how that's settling out. So what we're doing right now is actively trying to gather as much data as we can to learn and to watch and to see what will happen so we can make better decisions for the back half of this decade.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
You too. Thank you.
Great question. Go over here to the middle, please.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Ledina, and I am the Hudson Valley's Community College student trustee in New York, Troy, New York, and I'm an international student as well. So my main focus is electrical vehicle, which is an industry that is quickly expanding. How is that affecting the transportation and infrastructure department, and how is the department supporting this industry?
One of my favorite subjects. So
Mine too.
good. And we're going to need more like you developing expertise in this area, because this is where the automotive industry is going. Now, some people have asked, if this is where the automotive industry is going, why are you spending so much effort trying to push it? But the reason why there's been a lot of legislation and a lot of activity around electric vehicles for us is that while we think EVs will be the future no matter what, there are three things that we think are not guaranteed. One, will adoption happen quickly enough to help us meet our climate change goals that are so important to this country and to the world? Two, will this be available to people on equitable terms? Right? The first EVs were luxury items, but one of the most exciting things about EVs is that people can save money on gas, and the lowest income drivers are the ones who have the most on the line in that being affordable. Three, will this be a revolution led by America? And that's very important to President Biden, that we're creating American jobs on American soil with this EV revolution, and not having our biggest international competitors like China lead the way and have us racing to catch up. The answer to those three questions depends on a lot of things. It depends on making them affordable. That's why the Inflation Reduction Act took $4,000 off the cost of many used EVs and $7,500 or more off the cost of many new EVs. It's a matter of charging, and that's why we are partnering with the Department of Energy to create a nationwide network of chargers so that you never go more than 50 miles without hitting a charger. Now, that's easy in DC. You can't go more than 50 yards without hitting a charger. But I'm guessing in Wyoming, that's a little more complicated. And even in a place like DC, the private sector may not be installing chargers in certain areas where it is not yet profitable, even though their availability in, let's say, a multi-family apartment building with lower income residents could be a real game changer. So we're investing heavily in getting charging networks out in the states and partnering with the states to do it. So affordability, chargers, materials, and components. And we got to make sure that there is a made in America, or at least US-friendly supply chain for more of the process of getting these batteries put together. This conversation will transform many communities as we build refining capacity. But the other thing that's really going to matter is skills, as you all. It's making sure that we have a workforce prepared to continue designing, building, making, maintaining, operating these electric vehicles, whether we're talking about a car, whether we're talking about a bus, eventually a truck. Those are starting to come online. And that human capital piece is going to be very important to it as well. I'm very excited about what we can do with EVs, but it won't develop the way we need it to as a country if we don't all work on it together.
That is true. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Let's go over here again.
Hi, I'm Samantha Vave from Lansing Community College. I'm on the Board of Trustees. And when we're in places like New York or DC, the public transportation is incredible. But where I live in Lansing, it's pretty bus dependent. And when I first moved there, I was told, don't ride the bus, it's not safe for women. Yet many of our students are dependent on the bus. So my question to you is, how do we make our transportation, our public transportation, safer while reducing the stigma around using it?
Such a great question. And it begins with safety, of course. Safety and the perception of safety, which are both real but are distinct. And we have been in a lot of dialogue with transit agencies around the country on how to make sure we are reinforcing both the reality and the perception of safety on board. There's a chicken and egg thing here, right? Which is actually often in these contexts, the thing that makes you feel safest is other people. And the thing you most need in order to drive ridership is a feeling of safety. So much as was the case with Midwestern downtowns generally, just the city, I would say it's also true at a bus station or a bus itself, which is the more you see just people around doing their thing, the more you feel comfortable and safe. And I think that also gets to culture. You mentioned this stigma and this idea that buses are only for people who have no choice but to ride the bus. I would say buses are for anybody who wants a clean, efficient way to get to where they're going, where you can read the paper, do your homework, or safely be on your phone, and can be a great alternative for a lot of people to being behind the wheel. But for that to work out, it's got to be frequent, it's got to be reliable, it's got to be clean, it's got to be safe. And this is one of the reasons why we are undertaking that largest ever, again, can't say it enough times, the biggest federal investment in transit in history. But it's not just the funding, right? It's that conversation that transit should be a means of choice. I heard it once said that somebody posed the question: is a really civilized, well-off place one where even the poorest person has a car, or is it a place where even the richest person feels comfortable taking the bus or the subway? And if you're in New York, maybe it's not so unusual to see a millionaire on a subway car because it's literally just the best way to get somewhere and the fastest. But in places like where you and I live, in Michigan, it doesn't always feel that way. And I think we need to cultivate, and by the way, community leaders, as many of you are, can also lead by example on this. Spend some time on the bus. You learn a lot. I learned a lot as mayor, taking the bus around. And I think that can be helpful too. But on the hard side, the kind of physical facilities and the resources for safety, we're going to do our part as the US DOT, funding agencies like never before.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, we had one more microphone back there. You guys were strategically positioned behind the podium, so thank you, gentlemen, for moving the microphone where we can see it. We do have time for one more question, so go ahead, please.
Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for coming. Tom Witt from Heartland Community College. Thank you for coming to see our program. It's wonderful having you.
Really enjoyed the visit. Thanks for having me.
And my question is, obviously electric vehicles are front and center right now, so everyone knows about that. We have a manufacturer down the road, so we started a program. Are there any particular areas, transportation-related areas, that community colleges could get involved in that you think are not being covered enough? Are there any topics, industries, just anything you think is not getting enough coverage that we could get out in front of?
Yeah, great question. There's so many. I'll try not to geek out longer than I should, but let me point to a handful that I think are of interest. EVs obviously is huge and growing. So are drones. This is not just about kind of hobby stuff. Drones are going to be a more and more important part of our national aviation system in the years to come. And the skills associated with piloting them, maintaining them, I think is something that there will be more and more demand for. Artificial intelligence, we are, in my view, as a country, underreacting to just how profound these changes will be. We had a meeting a week or two ago on this, and kind of as a joke, I suggested that my team ought to just ask ChatGPT to write an artificial intelligence policy for the department. And I forgot all about it, and then they did and put it in my briefing book the next day. And it was pretty spooky how convincing it was. If they had told me that somebody had written it, I would have believed them. I know many of you are dealing with the implications of this for instruction. And again, it's hard to really say exactly what this is going to mean, but I think the most interesting thing to think about is not what it'll replace, but what it'll augment. DALL-E, have many of you seen DALL-E, this image creation program? It will maybe replace certain forms of technical drawing, but it will also create a whole new job description, which is somebody who's good at prompting this algorithm to paint a picture. Same thing with some of these chat tools. So I know it's early, but I guess finding the ways where this is already beginning to be applied and building that kernel of a set of skills, including in your instructor base, I think is going to be really important. And then, of course, there are always big things we just never know until they're upon us, which is why I think that the more soft capacity of change management and being nimble, and some of the soft skills, right, that we know are going to matter no matter what, how to deal with other people, and you find ways, whether it's particular as part of a unit or kind of threaded through your instruction to get that across. Those things we know are going to matter forever no matter what, right? So I approach this with humility because I think you rightly have a conversation with industry about what can most immediately lead to opportunities for your graduates. But I'm glad you're asking that question, and we're spending a lot of time thinking about it too, because it's fun and exciting, but also urgent that we think a couple of steps ahead. Thanks for the question.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Thank you for the question, and thank you for the initiative in moving the microphone for us. So, Mr. Secretary, we are out of time. There's probably lots of other questions. I know you're a busy man. Before we wrap up, any final comments or thoughts you'd like to share with these wonderful folks?
Yeah. So much is changing, but we know that certain things, to get to pick up on the last conversation, aren't going to change. And the way that humans interact with equipment, whether it's the interaction that a driver has with her car or the interaction that somebody in construction has with the equipment that's building these new bridges we're so excited about, that relationship is important, and it's always going to be important. The most important part of our transportation systems is people. It always has been, and it's always going to be. And that's why I'm so enthused about the work that you're doing. You are preparing people to interact with their built environment, with vehicles, with infrastructure in new ways, and making sure that things that we've been doing, not just things that are completely new, like dealing with AI, things we've been doing since the days of the Egyptians, like building roads, continue to advance. And as you do it, you are at the forefront of perhaps closing some of the biggest gaps in wealth and opportunity and access that have stood between America and the American dream. I know that just like my line of work, your line of work is sometimes, by people who aren't very forward-thinking, considered a little bit unsexy, maybe. People who don't understand that what's at stake, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but what's at stake in preparing people to thrive in their careers is nothing short of demonstrating that American society can continue to be the way that most people in the world want to live. It's that big. And I hope you're just propelled by a sense of mission in that, knowing everything that gets thrown at you, from budget constraints to community expectations to the whiplash of change, and still recovering from the shockwaves of the COVID pandemic. But I really believe that this infrastructure decade we're in will be one of the most important phases that we look at across this century, not just for my line of work, but for yours. And I want to thank you in advance for your continued partnership on that. And I hope to see many, many of you in your various communities as we hit the road. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you.